All right, I'm just going to dive in. What I want to talk about today is some GraphQL tooling that I think is really cool. It's all open source. It can work with any GraphQL server, including yours. I'm going to talk a bit about the Explorer, some export, some code gen, some search, and some futuristic stuff. All right, so if you know GraphQL, you probably know graphical. And if you haven't used the graphical extension here, the Explorer, you're missing out. This is by far the best way to explore any API. So what I can do here is visually open up and say, hey, I want to maybe search through this GraphQL API. I see that, hey, there's Spotify in there. I can just kind of explore and see the fields, and I see there's a search. And over here, I can say when. I want to search for all that. Any tracks that match that, I want to get some properties from them, maybe their ID and their name. I'm going to go ahead and run that, and I'll log into Spotify. And there we go. I'm making some API calls to Spotify, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to call this one search. But I want to actually also run some mutations. I want to have maybe a pause, and this is going to go into Spotify. It's going to pause the player. And then having modified that player, it's going to return to me the new state. And I want to know, hey, given that I just paused it, are you playing, and what's your progress? And we'll add just two more. One is next. And it's the same idea. So it's going to be Spotify, skip to the next track, having modified the player, let me know this, and one more, which is resume. And the cool thing is, with the way GraphQL is so introspectable, we can introspect the entire schema over here, which is how we can actually pull out all of these fields, and we can see all of the operations. So I'm going to do this, resume is playing. But once we've built up all these different operations, the queries themselves are also introspectable. So you can see here that it can enumerate all of those operations that I just did. So if I search here, or if I do pause, it'll run that and pause my player. And this is really cool. But this is not a necessarily useful context. It's really great for exploring. It's by far the most joyous way to experience an API. But really what you want to do after you experience an API is put it into a useful context. So what we did is we built a code explorer, which does the same thing. It actually introspects all of your code over here, and it generates an entire React application based off of it. So you can see here that if we change this and we say ReactiveConf, or we call it search, you can see that the code that is generated over on the right actually updates. And this code actually embeds the best practices for using a GraphQL API. So if you're an API provider, you can actually embed all of the best practices for how your users are supposed to be using your application. And if you want, you can just click a button here, and this is literally going to create a brand new code sandbox here. I'm going to go ahead and run it. And it's going to say, hey, you're not logged into Spotify, so I'll go ahead and log in. And now if I open up my Spotify player, and I put them side by side, I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to say, I want to pause my player. And I want to now resume, and I want to go next. And I actually built an entire Spotify player and a React application just by clicking around, and it's deployed where anyone can go to this application and control their Spotify player. So I think that being able to explore and export is huge. And I want to show one other feature that we are pretty excited about, which is searching through an API. Because APIs get bigger and bigger and bigger. And let's say, for example, I know somewhere in this API there's an email field, but I don't know where it is. I don't want to have to traverse the docs. I don't want to have to traverse the graph. Computers are really good at that. So this is literally going to search through the entire GraphQL schema in there and find all the fields that have something about email in them. And whenever I click it, it will build up that entire structure for me. So for example, if I know that I want to have maybe tracks in here somewhere. So I'll come down here, and I see that FedEx has some. And I see that YouTube has some. So I do track kind, and it builds up that. So I can basically say, somewhere inside of this API, give me this field, build up the whole query, and then generate an entire React application that I can just push and start tweaking that works immediately. It's an entirely new way of experiencing APIs. It's all open source. If you are an API provider, you should be offering this for your users. Thank you.
That was Sean Grove. We have questions for you. Are GraphQL servers safe from no SQL injection attacks?
Yeah, so GraphQL and SQL are two separate technologies. You can overlay GraphQL on top of SQL. In fact, there are several really amazing open source projects like PostGraphFile and Hasura that do that. They are by far the safest way of exposing your database to the front end. So yes, you can if you wanted to. You could figure out a way, I'm sure, to offer a server that enabled NoSQL injection attacks. But by default, no, GraphQL is not going to enable that.
And what are the most evident pros of GraphQL while comparing to REST API?
What a great question. So I just generated an entire React application. I explored different APIs. I was able to iterate and test and get data back immediately. Try doing that with any REST API. It is day and night difference. So at the very least, there are benefits for a provider, but from a consumer's point of view, it's day and night difference.
When should one decide to use Elastic SQL DB instead of cluster of single DBs?
So I generally find that Elastic SQL DBs are really good ways of trolling people whenever they're on stage. Yeah. But if you want to cluster that, that will actually enable you to troll multiple speakers, I think, at one time.
I love how you're looking at me like, I know what you're talking about, which I don't, which we figured out, by the way, I read the questions. But thank you so much, Sean. You were amazing.